Welcome to Merging Minds. Today, I'll be diving into the depths of authorship and AI with Stephen Marche, a Canadian novelist, essayist, and columnist. He has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Esquire, and many others. He has won the National Magazine Awards for fiction and nonfiction. He is also the host of the best-selling audio series How Not to Fuck Up Your Kids Too Bad, available on Audible. Stephen wrote a guide to the best books about artificial intelligence for the New York Times. He's the author of, among other works, On Writing and Failure and The Next Civil War. He has collaborated with artificial intelligence on the first AI-generated novel reviewed in New York Times, Death of an Author, a groundbreaking experiment in the meta-world of man meets machine. His most recent novel, The Last Election, was co-written with Andrew Yang. Welcome, Stephen. It's a pleasure to have you, and thank
Nice
you
to
so
meet
much
you.
for the conversation.
My pleasure.
So, Stephen, I've been having the pleasure of reading a little bit through your work these past few days. And my first question for you is I was really amazed at the diversity of the different subjects that you focus on and how you bring a lot of clarity to each of them. Where do you see the connection between this deep exploration into authorship and AI that you do, the next civil war, how not to
Yeah.
fuck up your kids too badly? Do you see a connection, or are these all very disparate parts of you?
I mean, I think it's like it's probably a bit of a problem for my life and career that I am so chaotic intellectually. Like I don't there's no brand. Like you know what I mean? Like there's just what happens is that I become obsessively fascinated with things and I can't really stop. And it's a bit like falling in love, and it's kind of out of my control. I just become absolutely really obsessed with certain subjects and feel like I need to understand them and I need to figure out how they work, and it keeps me up at night until it's done. So no, I don't really think there is any kind of or I mean, a therapist might tell me there's some order, but I can't. I honestly can't figure out why. Like it's just like AI was I happen to live in the neighborhood in Toronto where artificial intelligence was invented. And my daughter liked dogs, and my wife is allergic to dogs. So I would take my daughter to the dog park, and I would talk to all the people who invented AI, and it was just purely accidental. But on the other hand, when they told me what was happening, it was like, oh my god, this is incredibly interesting, and I needed to sort of pursue it to the end. Even though at that time, like 2017, 2018, it seems hard to imagine, but it was very hard to get editors interested in it. Like you would go to them and explain there's this thing called artificial intelligence, and they were like, this is science fiction nonsense. Bring me a real story. But it did. I just knew there was something really fascinating.
And I've been really struck by the death of an author because I haven't finished it, but I was a little bit skeptical about how it would feel to read a book. And I'm paraphrasing you here, but I remember the sentence that you described or remarked me. You said, "I didn't write any of the words of the book, but I'm 100% the author of everything." It's something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
am the creator.
the
Like
creator,
I'm the creator, but not maybe not the author because the word's
yeah.
not mine.
And as I was reading it, I was trying to imagine the kind of prompting that you were doing to get those sentences out and working with
Right.
these different models and really seeing like the art behind it. And it was it was a really interesting read, and like I said, I haven't finished it, but it felt very fluid. And I saw in some of your interviews how you describe how sometimes you found in this process that the AI is bad at some of the simplest parts, for instance, constructing an interesting plot, but can, for instance, also create really powerful descriptions and come up with things that people are not used to. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience,
Yeah.
like your writing process and how you crafted this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Morovich's paradox, the AI, am sure you know the AI paradox that AI can do very complicated things, manage a city, for instance, very effectively, but doing basic things like identify what a cow is, are very hard for artificial intelligence, right? And the same thing to me applies very much to writing, the writing process. So, to get, if you want the most, like, I remember being taught when I became a professor how to write a letter of recommendation for a student. And it was a Byzantine process. I mean, they really, I mean, they were like, you need to learn this because otherwise you're going to be screwing over the students you want to help. And, it was a huge, elaborate code of matrices of various vectors of information that you had to contain. It was, and I was recently asked to write a letter of recommendation. It was like straight to ChatGPT, put in the information. It did a infinitely better job than I could do. So I mean, I think those what I because I my first experiment with algorithmic writing, I had to build my own program, if you can imagine such a thing, was in 2017, and I did that for Wired, and then I've been experimenting all along. Like I did a 17% horror generated horror story for the LA Review of Books where I used GPT-3, and that was very simple because you just had the text that you wanted and then you had it fill in little bits. But I realized, from working with this stuff that the story is not what you want to go to AI for. It's not. It's just not very good at it. The most basic things, like, I mean, what is interesting is actually, that's not what's an artificial intelligence is good at. If you wanted to write something in the style of Li Bai, the Chinese nature poet, I mean, with unbelievable accuracy. I mean, better than any human writer could do, right? So, I mean, to me, it became a question of how to use these things appropriately. So, I mean, it was very experimental. I learned, I think, what the visual people have learned a long time ago, which is that the more specific the prompt, the better. Like the more detailed, like some of these prompts by the time I was getting to the end were 40 adjectives in them and had very specific lexical and syntactic structures in them. And then I would put that in pseudo, right, the stochastic writing instrument, and use it to fool around with it to get to something that was more fluid, and which was a little, and it was a very complicated process. I also used Cohere, which is a Canadian large language model company, who I'm a big fan of. And with them, I was able to train individual prompts and then train them on multiple examples and have them individually write single metaphors for me, which was by far the most interesting part of the process, but of course is much too labor intensive to actually, like, you could never write that way. It's just simply too labor intensive.
Interesting. And do you think there's something, because I share something, I think I share an attitude with you, which is this curiosity and eagerness to explore the capabilities of something. But I notice in our field, for instance, my particular field, working with translators, I noticed that there is also a lot of hesitancy, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety over, instead of focusing at as a tool that can enhance capabilities or change a process, more as a competitor or something that's going to take away things. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming that with authors it could be also kind of similar. There's some authors that are very resistant about the use of AI in that process. What do you think? I don't know if you agree with me, but if you, but I guess my question is: do you think there's something special or unique about your attitude that makes you more capable of harnessing these things as tools, or do you think this is something everybody has? How do you see that?
Well, I mean, I think there's absolutely pronounced resistance. I mean, translation's an interesting case because there's such a bulk need for it, right? Like there's just a huge market for translation, whereas creative work is, not to be in any way condescending to translation, but there's a certain kind of, like, a machine shouldn't make up a story, right?
Right.
As opposed to a task. And yeah, the resistance is enormous. In fact, to the point where the work that I want to make, like, before anyone cared about AI, I was able to publish things with artificial intelligence, but I can't anymore.
Oh, really?
Like, there's just no editor will touch this work.
Huh.
There's no machinery for dissemination of it. I've made some pretty extraordinary. I mean, I guess I'm saying it myself, but one project I did with the guys at Cohere was an infinitely regenerating story. So it was trained on prompts and then with examples, and it was the same. So it's the same story with the same characters and the same actions, just told differently, infinitely, right?
Wow,
Like,
that's fascinating.
and I thought that was like an infinite short story. This is something. No one would get anywhere near it. Like no one would people were very very frightened of it. And there's no funding apparatus. Like there's nowhere I can go to either disseminate the work or get funding to help create the work. And as you probably know, this stuff is expensive, right? Like it's not actually like it's all very good to say just plug into GPT, but if you actually want to make something new, like it requires quite a bit of manipulation and requires like access to an engineer, right? And since these engineers are paid catastrophic amounts of money, like when you come to them and say, "Hey, why don't you help me write a short story?" It's a rare person that's willing to do that. The resistance I think is actually really stultifying the art. I think it is. I've learned that, and I'm kind of it's upsetting to me. I think I am going to be able to find some avenues for some of this stuff, and of course, Death of the Author got out there, but there's huge resistance to it. Interestingly, it's a Western thing, right? So, like in Japan, a woman just won their version of the Pulitzer Prize for a book that was 5% written in
Oh
ChatGPT.
wow.
Chinese science fiction writers talk about using AI like it's not. I mean, it's just they don't even think about it, right? Like there is something about AI that really conflicts with Western notions of authenticity in art and the individual self, creator, right? And so yeah, that's like I think it's a huge stumbling block for me. I haven't found a way around it. I mean, maybe someone will start some institute and I can go to work, but I mean, I've been trying to find that home for a long time, and it's I'm telling you, it's even for a freelance writer who's used to getting knocked around, like it's people don't want it. So like I think there's a sort of interesting thing where people kind of regard AI as inevitable, like it's inevitably going to happen, and it's like, well, actually no. Like there's actually like you need to make it happen. So it's a tricky moment for this technology for sure, and for this art.
It is.
I'm definitely with you. I mean, I think it's a fascinating. I mean, I have so many fascinating things I could do with this, but it is hard to find the place and the market. Indeed,
Yeah,
to market it.
you mentioned something that I really want to unpack. So you mentioned this idea of artificiality and how it's almost inherent, intrinsic, and as being inauthentic.
Yeah,
And it's even in the name, right? Something artificial.
yeah,
It's not something real. It's synthetic. It's yeah, it's not human. And in many ways it is very human. It is very and I wonder, this is something that I guess, I don't want to get too psychoanalytical here, but I noticed that in the whole Civil War analysis that I was also reading about that you did, you're talking a lot about polarity, right? A lot about left to people on the left and people on the right, and Democrats and Republicans, and how these different frames of mind. And I can't help but seeing like something analogous happening with AI. Almost like it gets politicized even before it exists. And I would love to see hear your take on that.
Well, I mean, I was amazed because I'd been following it before ChatGPT, right? I remember like having stories about AI that no one like pitching and no one was interested in, and it was just such a struggle to get work out. I remember sort of before the narrative took over, and it was just extraordinary to me how quickly the fear and greed narratives just took over, right? Like, I mean, it was just like, and they're ridiculous. Like they're both actually ridiculous. Like this is one of the most fascinating things human beings have ever produced. Right? The transformer is one of the most fascinating inventions in human history. I mean, that's really what it is, and no one cares. No one asks, what does this say about us? It's like, is it going to kill us, and can it make me rich? And like, those are the only questions that they're asking. And like, to me, the stakes of artificial intelligence are literally like, what is the nature of human identity in language, right? Like a truly epic question,
Yeah.
right? Like a question of the greatest profundity has been posed before us, and nobody cares. Like it's yeah, it was appalling to me. Like, it was one of those things where it's like, I really, I'm too old really to be this naive. Like, that's what I thought to myself. I'm like, of course human beings are just human beings. They just go straight for the fear and greed. But I genuinely didn't think that was going to happen. And I guess I'm just like a, sweet little guy from Western Canada, and you can't really get it out of me. Like, it's I mean, it was I found the response to it so upsetting, and amazingly, from people who really should have known better. Like, not just idiot journalists, not just like from serious engineers, geniuses. Like people who really, really should have known better than to say things like there's a 0.1 chance that it's going to be the end of humanity. They should have known how that would have been, received to the world, right? And so yeah, like I found the whole thing very upsetting.
And do you think there's, and I guess this is, and I agree with you. I mean, I also, this whole experience with transformer models really makes me rethink who I am and what makes me me. And I find it very profound and almost spiritual also in a way. But,
Definitely, it's a
but
spiritual question.
yeah, and I noticed that again. It's really fascinating because I live in this little microcosm with a lot of translators and people who need to get things translated, and it's so hard to get past any headline. It's like the only
Yeah,
communication that happens with someone is at the headline level, and then all the text is just gibberish.
yeah.
And is this just something that you think is like inherently human? Is this a product of our times? Is there a way to get past this? I would love. How do you see
I
this?
mean, I did my PhD on the Renaissance, on English drama of the 1610s and later, and there was a explosion of pamphlets then. There was a pamphlet culture that's not super dissimilar to our own information era, right? An era of flooding information and chaos that ensues from it, right? And I think the reaction is extremely human, and the way, but so was getting out of it, right? Like, so was getting out of the nightmare of the information flood. That was also human, and we also did that. And I think, some things, I think with AI in particular, I think, like, we've all heard the stories about how it's going to be the end of the world, and we woke up 6 months later and it's not the end of the world, right? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's like the headlines were like, this is going to end humanity, and it's like, no, what's probably going to end humanity is what is war. Like, that's what's, like that, like war and the stupidity of war, which is also human. Like, that's actually what's going to kill us, and like, yeah, and I think we are obviously at a very low ebb in our information networks. Like, we are in a place where consensus reality is very endangered. I'd say beyond endangered. Like, it's
Right.
I'm not sure that it super exists
Yeah,
anymore.
exactly. I
And
would
and,
wonder if
and,
it
and
is still.
yeah, I think it's dead, and that creates a huge amount of toxicity. But I mean, I guess I'm naive again, but like, in political, in mass media, when you're dealing with 350 million people of the United States, that's one thing. I thought when you're dealing with literally an expert subject, which requires quite a bit of training even to get your hands around the most basic concepts, this would not happen, right? But I mean, how many people writing about AI could even tell you what a transformer is, even
Right.
know what the T in GPT stands for? Maybe 1 in 10, maybe.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I think it's, also, I think one of the things is that because I was using it all the time, like, so I used earlier models, right? Like, I saw DaVinci 2, I saw GPT 2, I saw GPT 3, I saw the leaps, and I saw also, like because I saw that and I used it, I understood it as always as a tool, right? And that was, and whereas other people, they arrive at ChatGPT and like, oh, there's a new consciousness, and it's like, no, this is just a very sophisticated linguistic model, like that is applying statistics to language in a very, very incredibly fascinating and revealing way. But that's what it is. I think that got lost. Like if you didn't have that perspective of growth with it, I could see why it would be so shocking when you suddenly ask it to plan your trip to a golfing trip to the southwestern United States, and it just does it perfectly. But I mean, I don't know. It was not as shocking to me when it came.
But yeah, and I think maybe it could be the fact that you were using the earlier models, but maybe I'm wrong. But I do see a connection as far as people who have a spirit of genuine curiosity
Yeah,
have an easier time of playing with novelty as something potentially interesting, maybe sure with risks, but some potential interest. But the way I see it, so many people are so focused on not changing at any cost that anything that is a threat to any change is already, you know, burned to the ground
yeah.
even before it gets a chance to be
Well, I
really
think
analyzed and experimented with.
I think AI also had the bad fortune to appear after 10 years of social media,
Hmm.
right? Where like all these companies totally irresponsible. Like the government forces were so stupid. They, like the internet is a series of tubes. The people on technology committees are saying these things. Like and we see the disasters of it. I've got a 12-year-old girl. Like I'm terrified of her getting Instagram, right? Like it's like so we all saw that, and then AI came and it just felt like something new, where it just felt like more tech lord nonsense. Do you know what I mean? Whereas to me, it's the opposite, right? Like to me, it's like a very profound revelation. And I also think, like, as someone who professionally uses language, like, to me, when you actually use this as a tool, what this is to me is it's ultimately going to be something like the microwave of language, right? Like it's going to be, you're going to use it to heat up your coffee and to do and also, like, Michelin star restaurants are going to use it in very specific ways to get very specific effects. And they're going to, but also, like, the McDonald's are going to use them to make things more rapid. But the microwave is just one tool. Like no one's gonna not want home cooking. No one's gonna go into a restaurant and want, give me your best microwave cheese sandwich. Like that's not really how it works, right? Like I think that's why I've never been afraid of it. Because I think just because I've used it so much.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love the microwave analogy. It's brilliant. And I think, just to make the parallel, you mentioned a little bit about the differences between authoring and translating. And I agree with you. I think when you're translating, you're already starting with a very clear prompt to begin with. You're starting with a lot more context from the very beginning, right?
Right.
The sentence in a given language, that is a lot of context. So there's less creative work left for sure. That's 100% in my opinion. But and I think that also increases maybe a little bit the feeling that instead of, because what you're describing, and I agree, it's like if you feel like a chef and you're able to see, like, okay, this microwave can be very useful in certain contexts and in certain situations, and I can use it to create amazing things that without it I would never be able to do that. That's exciting. But I think a lot of people, particularly, and maybe I'm not sure how it would apply to authors in general, and I'm sure that there are authors of a very wide spectrum of kinds of genres and visibility and fame and all of that. But it seems that there seems to be a large amount of the population that I come into touch with that simply doesn't feel like a chef in their own world. They feel like
Right.
they're just putting things
Indeed.
into the oven and getting things out, putting things in and getting things out. And if you tell them that now there's another oven or another thing that they have to use, they freak out because they don't think of themselves as masters of their own kitchens in your metaphor. And I don't know, do you agree with that, or do you think that's maybe an educational thing? And is there something we can do about it?
Well, I think the every technology has uptake, right? Like it takes a while for people to get used to every different tech. I mean, ChatGPT 3 is the fastest. Had more. I think it had 100 million users in what was it, 3 months or something? I mean,
Yeah, it was,
something
I don't know,
absurd,
it was crazy. Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, what took Facebook 4 months to get, 4 years to get to, they got to in a month or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
something ridiculous. But I mean, like, I think one thing people is becoming clear to people. I mean, I remember in the very early days, right after ChatGPT launched, I was one of the very few people who had any knowledge of artificial intelligence, linguistic artificial intelligence. And so I was going on all these talks and all these tours to all these different companies that wanted me to talk to them. And I remember one very interesting person who shall remain nameless, but they were translating for the military, for the US military, which is a massive task. And at that point, they suddenly needed a ton of Russian translators, right? Like they had all these Arabic translators. They'd been training these people how to translate, and suddenly they needed like 1,000 people who knew how to speak very good Russian very quickly. It's very hard to pivot on that, even when you've got brainiacs, right? Like even when you've got people who learn languages very quickly, right? And so they were trying to figure out if they could automate it, right? Like how much of this they could automate. And they all told me the Monte Cassino story. Do you know that story?
No,
You probably do.
I don't
Well,
think I do.
so in World War II, there was a Monte Cassino is an area above Rome, and it was a extremely important historical site, an incredibly beautiful like architecture, and it was like a world historical site. And the Pope negotiated an agreement between the Allies and the Germans that no one would bomb it as long as it was never. And the agreement was as long as nobody used it as a headquarters, right? And a American translator mistranslated the word for headquarters out of German.
No
And
way.
because of that, Monte Cassino got bombed. We don't have Monte Cassino anymore. And 50,000 Allied troops died and 20,000 German troops died. And
Oh
this
my
is like
God.
a story that they bring up because it's like one word was off and it cost 70,000 lives, right?
Wow.
And so they can't just automate it, right? Like they can't just. It's not like they can just suddenly go like, oh well, we'll just go to a machine and do this because it's not a question of just the question of error. It's a question of where are your errors,
Right.
how significant are those errors,
Right.
how does that change the meaning of the text. These things all require human beings, right? And so the machines are going to be used, but there's always going to be human beings at the end of it because you need people to blame. You need people to blame, you need people to fire when they screw up, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's like I found that a very fascinating. But at the time they were they're going to have to figure out a way to use this tech. They're probably talking to you. You probably just can't mention it on this thing. But it is exactly figuring out the where the human supervision can maximize the technology that the that's where this is going to be effective. Like that's ultimately where this is going to end to me.
No,
But you probably already know that.
I agree, and it's just for me, for instance, maybe just this is just a personal thing, but when I translate using this kind of tech, I don't feel less of a translator. I feel even better. I have to type less.
Right.
I stress less. I know that potential silly mistakes are going to get flagged for me. I enjoy it. It's a fun process for me. But I know that for a lot of translators that created this craft over many years of like typing each and every word out, and researching in dictionaries or going online into multiple sources, and maybe spending half hour to figure out the right term in that right context. It's almost like they don't want that work to be given to them, and because that's what they do, it's like super tied to their identity. And
Yeah.
I wonder, is this something that's just inherently hard for humans to change their MO and how they relate to their work? Or is this something, just that's just particular to this group of people, this time? because I'm really fascinated by it, because I love I mean, I resist change on one end, but I'm also very fascinated by it. And when I look around, it seems that a lot of people around me are really just very, very afraid of it's not using AI, it's actually losing their identity, losing what makes them special.
I mean, to me, like as a writer, like the ultimate compliment is having your work translated, right? Like that is the like when the next Civil War is, it's been translated into German, French, Portuguese, about to be translated into Arabic. That means that someone has actually decided that they're going to write your book rather than writing one of their own. But on the other hand, we do live in a world where, like, there's a whole ton of Japanese literature that I cannot access because it has not been translated. And there's no market to translate it. It's me, weirdo, who wants it. And if there were some semi-automated way to make that possible, I would love it. I really think what's going to happen genuinely is that it's like the camera, right? Like the camera was not considered art for a long time, right? Like, and then we realized, like, there are people who are incredibly good at taking photographs, right? And it's not the same as hand drawing and painting, but it's an art. And then we also realized that there were people who were good at having their photographs taken. If you'd explained that to somebody in 1870, that there would be a class of people who would be paid professionally gigantic sums of money because they were good at being photographed, they literally, you literally could not have explained it to them. They would not have understood, right? And I think we're in the same place now. We don't, but like there is going to be a translator who figures out how to use the tech to get really good, really fast, really excellent translations of things. And I think also it's like there's translation, right? Like if you're translating Albert Camus' The Outsider, this is one task. If you're translating the manual for a 1988 Toyota Hyundai, this is a different matter,
Right.
right? And like one and figuring out that which one uses the tech in which ways and where it's effective and where it's not. That makes I think that also is going to be part of the art, right? Like similarly, like when you think of like avant-garde cooking, where they use like sous vide, right? Like a lot of people consider that to be really unacceptable. I think it's going to take a while for every industry to figure out what this is for, and also what it's not for, right? And I think I'm not afraid of it at all. I mean, just the same way that, like, you're a bit younger than me, but like I remember, or maybe you're just California healthy. That's another that's another option. But I remember when Photoshop came around, and there was a whole class of people who would like literally cut out photographs and put them on trays and send them to factories, and they all lost their jobs. But there was a whole new class of designer that emerged, that there were hundreds, like 100 times more people were into design after Photoshop than before. Like I mean, it just became a truly mainstream job, right? And I think every one of these technologies to me has that same result.
Yeah, you mentioned many fascinating things that I want to unpack. One of them is the accessibility factor, which is that Japanese example. It's like there's so much more content that doesn't get translated than it does than the content that does get translated, and there's so much wealth in that, intellectual wealth, that gets simply lost because there's no market for it. And by lowering the access cost to it, all of a sudden you make so much more knowledge accessible to so many more people. And the other thing that you mentioned, which I particularly like, but I notice that people have a hard time accepting this concept, is this iterative idea that content doesn't have to be in its final form when you first consume it. So like maybe you want to read maybe this Japanese novel that you really are into, and maybe the first round that you look at, you don't really like that much. The sentences aren't really that well put together and it's machine like, a little bit robotic. But the more people access it, the more work gets put into making it better. And eventually, you go from not being able to access it at all to at least having something, to eventually having something really good. But
Yeah.
allowing the text and to evolve through this process, as opposed to having this all or nothing thing. Either it was translated by like a masterful person, or you don't have anything at all. So I don't know. Would love your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, this is the kind of thing where the dreams that we have, that you and I have, are both totally doable, but also are never going to happen. Like, I mean, just similarly, well, I don't know, never going to happen. I mean, it's sort of like the same thing that happened with Google Books, right? Where it's like, if there'd been an effort to fuse academia with Google Books and to create, there could be a universally accessible digital database of every classic of world literature in like the Bodleian Library, New York Public Library, like Robarts Library here, which is actually a superb collection. All of these collections could have been universally accessible, and some human beings got in the way of that, right? Like, and it got, but that would have been a majestic gift to have left the future, right? Like that would have been and similarly, like I'm really obsessed with Chinese literature in particular, um, and you get tiny the works that are available in translation are tiny fragments because the canon is so enormous. Like if you wanted to do something on the Tang Dynasty poetry, it is enormous. The translations of it are always selections, and they're often of the same 200 classic poems that are the mainstay of that canon. But I mean, I would love to be able to access the huge body of, like, the poetry sometimes gets translated and big novels get translated, but like there's a huge tradition of essays in these cultures that never get touched, like that just simply never get a look in, right? Because it's not a genre that sells, right? And I mean, I would love to be able to see those things. It's a loss, and of course, this technology absolutely could be used to do this sort of thing, but it'll probably just get turned to like, how do we ramp up the algorithm to make 13-year-old girls buy more Sephora, right? Like, I mean, that's what it'll be ramped up for.
Yeah,
That is human nature, I think.
that not very exciting, but I have to agree with you that is the nature of where things end up
Yeah.
going.
I mean, I
But
would love a university. Like, I've been so, like, I have a PhD, and so I saw from the inside of academia, um, how, I mean, if you want to talk about fear of technology, like, and even when they do attempt technology, it's always the most shallow and like pathetically narrow questions that they ask, and they never actually turn it into something like grand, which it could be, which could so easily be, under these new conditions of information. I do, what happened when we were talking before about the Renaissance and what happened with pamphlet culture. The way that the English got out of this civil war of information that they were in, this furious, is that they started the Royal Society, and the Royal Society was like, we're gonna create reliable information, right? And
oh
that was
wow,
the beginning, really, of modern science,
huh.
right? Like, as we know it, and we need it. We basically need new institutions of that kind.
Could there be a new Royal Society in the horizon for us, or do you think
Oh
that's too
God.
far fetched?
Well, I mean, I I'm not going to build it. I'm sorry, I don't have any money. But, like, like, I definitely think with AI in particular, I'm just amazed at how the only things that have any money are AI ethics institutes, which come up with the same five talking points over and over and over and over and over again, not particularly relevant to the situation we find ourselves in, and not particularly curious or interesting, or even trying to understand what might be good about this.
Hmm.
Just simply repressive mechanisms for control, which also, by the way, the AI companies are not even remotely worried about. Like, they're not going to be controlled by any of these laws, even a tiny bit. So it's yeah, we have a long way to go.
I agree. And one thing that that crosses my mind a lot, and I think that has connects back to the idea that of that infinite. I don't know how you described it exactly, but this infinite novel where, as
Yeah,
you read it, it
it was a
evolves
story.
differently. Infinite
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
But it's this idea that the very nature of reading can also change, because if you have data that's used that can capture, let's say, my sentiment while I'm reading, and that can
yes.
inform maybe the next sentence that I read or the next paragraph that I read. Maybe you and I can read the same book that are going to be completely different versions, kind of created as we go along based on how we react to certain things.
I
Do
looked
you
into
see that
that
as a
too.
possibility?
Oh yeah, I looked into that. I mean, it's harder to do because you need pretty sophisticated facial recognition software, and everyone hates it. Everyone hates like facial recognition software. The only people that you can make use facial recognition software are like literally captive populations,
Hmm.
like under authoritarian governments.
Wow.
Like those, everyone else, no. Like for it doesn't matter what the benefits are. It doesn't matter what the like it's going to cut down crime or whatever. People do not want facial recognition artificial intelligence. They don't,
Hmm.
right? And the only way it's ever going to be used is going to be slipped through. I mean, they looked into, I think there was some experiments at Disney with it, as I recall, where they were trying to use it. I mean, actually, Disney is the place where the most interesting experiments in creative AI are happening. I wish they would let
Really?
someone like me in, but of course, they. I mean, I knew the guy who was doing it at Warner Brothers. He was a very interesting man, and they had some really interesting projects on the go. But then the strike happened, and basically they shut it all down.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
They really didn't. They were. It was like too much trouble, more trouble than it's worth. So when people say that AI is inevitable, I respectfully disagree. Like it's actually being quite shut down. Right. Like the social reaction to how this technology is 100% going to shape how it is received. I think that's something the AI companies actually have not thought about.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
think they think
enough.
they typically think that they're above that froth and that somehow
Yeah.
it's all going to come together.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah, and I think that's a big mistake. I genuinely do. Like they need to understand themselves as social entities, but of
Mm.
course that's so anathema to the whole tech sensibility,
Yeah.
right? Like you know what I mean? Like it's just so antithetical
Yeah.
to the whole approach of even of engineering itself, right?
Exactly.
That it's they probably never will. It is definitely a two culture situation, right? Like
I agree. And again, with
the
the motif of polarization, like
yeah,
it seems like whatever we do, it gets polarized into these different camps, and these camps don't talk to each other, and the animosity only intensifies, the lack of
yeah.
dialogue intensifies, and drives us back to the Civil War. But
And the headlights that register are the stupidest ones, right? The
yeah,
most extreme ones that just
exactly.
are like anyone who's in this business is like, no. Like, I mean, you can only be like, I mean, I find as a writer trying to write about, I wrote a piece for The Guardian against AI doomerism, and I've written, but you can only write that piece like 5 or 6 times, or you can't write it anymore, right? Like at a certain point, you're like, I've said this, like, but people just they want that apocalyptic sensibility. They really do. It's tragic, really.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And one curiosity, as I read the death of an author, man, maybe I'm just a terrible literary person, but I found some threads of similarity with Kurt Vonnegut, particularly with The Breakfast of Champion. And I tell you where I found it. Like I I noticed that you used or the way you interacted with the prompts, that there were certain names like God Inc. and like the creation of certain, it was like this reality that was very similar to ours but slightly different. It just felt like there was this like little sci-fi edge to it. I don't know. Have you ever thought about it that way? Because I really find that it's such a, I love that genre. That's just, it feels like it's us, but not quite us, just slightly distorted in a way that really when you see things like God Inc., it's like God, but a company. It's this stuff that creates this very visceral reaction in me. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just reading it wrong.
I didn't think about Vonnegut. I didn't put in Vonnegut into any of the engines. Obviously the main female character, the main writer, is she's based on a sort of version of a cross between Margaret Atwood and my father.
Oh
So
wow.
like it was, yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly right. Get straight to the Oedipal core of the whole of being a Canadian writer. But I think obviously it was sort of hard. It was genre fiction with this kind of science fiction edge to it. But I I didn't put things into it that I didn't think could happen, right? Like I thought all of these things were sort of possible,
Yeah.
like and I still actually think they are possible. But that world that he inhabits, where he's creating these things. This is obviously a fantasy of my own, because that world doesn't exist, right? Like they're just there's tech companies building this stuff, unclear what the use cases are. There are people like you who are finding the use cases in specific tasks. But to me, the creative effulgence of it that seems to me so possible, or the use of it for true human benefit, I would say, like I don't really see the space for that to be negotiated.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I don't see the institution where that can happen. Maybe it's just I'm so Canadian. I always think an institution is the solution to everything. But on the other hand, it seems to me ripe for that kind of thing. And none of the places that I see do anything except warn about how it's going to eat the world or whatever.
I agree with that, and I wonder, like, there's such power in writing when you're imagining this reality that could be, right. You're exploring all these possibilities. It's almost like you're making room for that to actually happen. And I saw in one of your interviews how you were personally kind of terrified of this idea of how they now there's a movie on the Civil War being released, and how that
Yeah,
can potentially even change the potential of that something like that actually happening. This connection between life in imitating art versus art imitating life. How
right.
do you see these things and this power of writing for you personally?
Well, I mean, I don't think writing is very powerful.
Oh really?
I don't think no. I don't think well, I tried my best to like describe AI like as it was coming, and I mean I was one of the only people writing about it for a while. No one paid it. It didn't matter at all. Like it went straight to the fear and greed right away. I actually think ideas are have very limited power.
Yeah, I was
And
meaning more as it's powerful for the author, not necessarily for the reader.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, what else? Like, as I said at the beginning, like I've fallen to fascination with these things and I can't get out. Like, I mean, well, I think for the AI stuff, if I were the kind of person who was capable of making institutions do things, that is for sure what I would do, right? But that's not like, my gift is that I am fascinated with things. It's not that I can do things. So it's not that I can build things, right? Like I'm actually incredibly poor at making institutions do anything that I want at all. But I wish I did have that ability. I really do, because I think there's so many interesting things that could be done with artificial intelligence, and the spaces have really not been taken. They have not been fulfilled, and I think it's someone is going to do it. There's going like I think one of the things about AI creativity is that it's one of those things that requires a combination of the ability to navigate significant capital resources, because it is expensive, with creativity, with technique, right, with the technical stuff. And what is going to happen is that a Walt Disney is going to come, right? And a Walt Disney is going to be able to fuse all of them together, and that person will be a trillionaire, right? Like that, that person will be able to turn this into a coherent tool that is just so useful and so desirable. And I mean, it would just harness the power of it, just the way that Disney did with animation, right?
Right.
Like it's a, but it requires that it's going to require a person of that type that's capable of navigating the creative, the financial, and the technological, and that's a rare person. That's a genuinely rare human being.
I agree. And you think you write it, and I was also reading the how not to actually hearing the how not to fuck up your kids too bad.
Well, you have
Uh,
been reading my stuff. Eh? You
I
have been
have,
going
yeah.
in. Yeah.
I did a deep dive as much as
Yeah.
I could, and I see that you also put in a great deal of thought into how to raise kids. I have three myself, and a lot of what we're talking about really seems to touch on education, at least for me. It's like this, you're just mentioning like there are not many humans that think like that, and as far as like reading and being interested, going beyond the headlines. And I look at, for instance, how the school framework that my kids are in, and they're all really good schools,
Yeah.
but they, at least my it seems to me that they're not really teaching them how to think critically about things. Like they're still teaching, my daughter's like 14 years old, she's still learning history from a factual perspective, as if there are facts as opposed to narratives, and as opposed to
Right.
ideas and opinions and politics and points of view and ideology. um, and I wonder, like, is do you think this is just inherent to the educational system? Is there something that can change regarding that? Because I notice it seems to me that that's just so pivotal in everything that we're talking about, is like being able to make your own opinion about things and have your own view of the world.
Well, it's interesting because I was writing about ChatGPT. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic called "The College Essay is Dead," which got a lot of attention. I think one of the things that's very interesting about AI specifically is that the way I was educated how to write was a very kind of technical approach. Like, this is how you construct. I actually got a very old-fashioned education where it was, this is how you build a simple sentence. This is how you build a complex compound sentence. This is how you build a compound. This is a complex sentence. These are clauses. This is the graph. This is how like the tree graph and so on, parsing sentences. And then I learned how to like create an opening paragraph with um, a good sentence, a good thesis statement, and then three paragraphs, and then a concluding statement going out. And that's how I've made my living, right? Like off of those skills. And ChatGPT replaces those skills. Like the fluid, elegant writing that I've mastered through craft, like a machine can now do that, and or they can do a version of it, right? And I was talking to my son about this, who's about to go off to university, and he was like, it's interesting. It's like they were teaching you how to write like a machine, and now we're going to have to teach people how to write like people. And I think that's exactly right. Right? Like because it's like what is this is not because like people are going to change. It's like what's going to very naturally and organically happen is that smooth writing and elegant writing and like technically correct writing is going to be hugely devalued because it
Right.
can be automated, right?
Yep.
Similarly, like I remember as a kid, like spelling, because people who couldn't spell, people thought they were stupid, right? Like, but what's going to matter instead is your ability to express new ideas and to have original points of view. And I think there's some undergraduate students who think that AI is going to save them a lot of work, but I don't think so. Because I think what's going to happen is your teachers are going to require an actual original idea, which
Right.
was not required when I
Right.
was an undergraduate, right? Like I just had to fulfill a format well to get a B plus. And I think that's about to be over in a way. So I think we're like the educational frame is going to change, but it has been changing for a long time, right? Like, I mean, if you find a spelling mistake on a document now, all you think is, oh, their spell check didn't work. You don't think, oh, they don't know how to spell, right? It's a, and that's not, that didn't change writing.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? That didn't change the value of being able to write well. It just didn't. Like, there's like it just meant that what was emphasized and what was powerful and what was special and what distinguished people from other people in terms of craft changed. And I think AI is just going to be another part of that. Like I think, but I'm not really afraid of that either. Like I think it's good to learn how to write like a person. Like I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I've been seeing it with me. I mean, I don't write as much as I'd love to, but I do try to write as much as I can, and I've noticed how much less mechanical my writing has become because I otherwise it's like GPT can do this better than me, and in fact,
Exactly.
it's the noise, it's the departures, even the things that sound funky. That's the interesting stuff. It's almost like jazz music, right? It's not about playing the notes; it's about how do you depart from that basic harmonic framework. And I really find that beautiful. But yeah, I'm very optimistic in that regard as well, I think. And like you said, tying back to the beginning, it's almost like a mirror that makes us rethink who we are. That's really
Yeah.
how I experience it.
Yeah, that's me
And
too. Yeah. It's a collective machine,
yeah.
right? Like it's a machine of collective intelligence, right? So you should only be writing if you're better than the collective intelligence,
And I
right?
guess
Like
that's what so many people feel afraid about, right? Am I better than this collective intelligence?
exactly. But you know, I think as you say, when you what you want to write now, you actually have to make it a little weirder to make it clear. I made this for you, right?
That's your
Like it's
watermark,
like
right?
yeah, like exactly. It's like this is something that I made for you. I'm expressing feelings to you. I didn't go into a machine. You know, I didn't go to my automated thing on Gmail where it's like, thanks, sure, let's meet. You know, like where it comes up and you put one of three and you press that, right? Like it, you know,
Yeah.
it like that's a different task. But I mean, I think it's a better task than the laborious formulas that I learned. You know, like it really is.
Same for me. And Stephen, this was such a fascinating conversation, really a treat for me.
I really
And
enjoyed it too.
if people, I mean, I know that your website is a great resource because you have a lot of essays that are available there, a lot of links to your publications. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to point people that so that they can get to know more about your work?
Well, I'm on Twitter and I'm on all the socials. But you know, my books, Next Civil War, Last Election, Writing and Failure, I'm proud of them. Death of
I,
an Author. If you're interested in
I'm
this, Death of
enjoying
an
them
Author.
all, and I'm bound to continue them till the very end. And are you working? What are you working on next?
I'm working on a well. I have a big article coming out about the invention of the transformer, where I interviewed everyone who was involved in it, which is I'm very excited about. Um, but I'm working on a large book about celebrity and power, which I've been
Oh
working on
wow,
for a long time. Yeah, so
very cool.
that's a thing I'm working on now.
Well, I'll definitely stay tuned for all of that.
For
All
sure,
right.
I'll send you a note when it comes out.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you so
Okay,
much, Stephen. Huge
no
pleasure
problem.
having you on. And thank you so much, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.